We now move on to our keynote address. It's a real privilege to introduce Professor Scott Avery. Scott is a Professor of Indigenous Disability Health and Wellbeing in the School of Public Health right here at UTS in Sydney. He's an Aboriginal man descendant from the Worimi people and is profoundly deaf. Dr. Scott, as he prefers to know, is a recognised educator, research and policy advisor on Indigenous cultural approaches for inclusion of people with disability. His groundbreaking publication, Culture is Inclusion, a narrative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability, has influenced national policy across Closing the Gap, Australia's disability strategy and the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with Disability. He's been appointed as an expert advisor to numerous government bodies and he's advocated on Indigenous and disability rights at the United Nations. I'm also so pleased to share on behalf of our Chair Claire, who's up late at night overseas, that our board has appointed Scott as an independent director to the National Disability Research Partnership. Scott was helpful and integral in helping establish the NDRP as a member of the Working Party, and we're so delighted we'll be working with you on this. Today, in the context as we launch this funding round, First Nations partnerships and investment in leadership, Scott's perspective is both timely and essential. Please join me in welcoming Scott for our keynote address.
Good Jigu, which is hello and welcome in my native language of Gatang. Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Mary, and the invitation to speak. It was a broad brief I was given, you know, how Indigenous knowledge can help shape an inclusive future in disability research. But I just want to add my acknowledgement that we are on Gadigal land and the traditional owners. I do want to thank, we have one of our finest elders in the room that I've ever met in my life, Auntie Glendra. Just grounds me in community. Our work we do, the stories that you bring, your personal experiences, the connection we have, it keeps the work we do real. And you also remind me, yes, it's my fault. I do want to acknowledge other Indigenous people who are in the room. I won't point you out by name, but I just want to acknowledge that there are deaf Indigenous elders and leaders in the room, and I notice and acknowledge your presence here, and any other Indigenous people who I haven't happened to catch the eye of. And also to acknowledge the presence of the Minister. It adds some gravitas to know that what we do in disability research in academic circles actually has an impact. And I have great respect for people who turn up. We are fundamentally relational people and people who turn up. And to you all who have turned up to listen today, I just want to acknowledge every single person's presence here. So the broad brief I was given was what can Indigenous knowledges, and I find our work when you're doing Indigenous and disability, it's a little bit inch thick, miles wide, so many things we could say. So I'm going to focus on three things, three contributions that I can see Indigenous knowledge could make. The first is an Indigenous culture of inclusion and wellbeing, a worldview of disability that is different to what many people are conditioned to. The second thing is our history and legacy of truth-telling. And the third is how we see the history, how our role in the history, how the present we have has had a past and our past has a future. And what we do now and what we do today will shape what the future generations. So the first contribution I want to talk about, and Mary had mentioned this in the introduction, is cultural inclusion. So the history of cultural inclusion, and it's a book that we wrote. I see this as not a piece of research as much, though I have to talk about this in the university so it's recognisable. It's the story of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability. Now, its origins came, so a long, long time ago in a career past, I was working on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health plan. This is 2012. So this is a version of the health plan that says we envisage a health system free of racism, which was very much a breakthrough discourse, because it used to be, oh, what do you mean by that? Is that like non-discriminatory healthcare practices? And we're kind of going, oh, yeah, racism. And we still haven't got there with ableism yet. But when I was involved in that, the health groups were talking to the doctors, they were talking to OTs, they were talking to the physiotherapists, they were talking to the speech pathologists, they were talking to teachers, and going, you're actually talking to the people with disability, and their voice was completely absent. I remember doing my systematic research back then, is what you have to do for your PhD, and I found 4 articles that made any mention of First Nations and disability research. So this came, so we just said, oh, hang on, we can't rely on others to speak for ourselves, we have to do this ourselves. And we're kind of thinking if we want to change the system, we actually have to start teaching. And if we have to start teaching, we have to start writing the curriculum, and that means we play in the research space. So we came up with the idea, and we had one research question. We went to as many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as we could find and asked them, what is your story? And because that is something they've never been asked. Tell us your story on your terms, in your time and in your space. And we thought at the time it'd all be about the NDIS, because that was happening at that point of time. And it wasn't. People didn't talk about their disability. They talk about their experiences of being isolated and marginalised in their communities, not being able to access their communities because some of the basic public health infrastructure that we take for granted in places like where we are today were not available to them. Healthcare services that were not available, which chronic conditions like disability we would see as a health condition in a remote community where preventative health is not there, is actually seen as pre-disability because it'll just lead to amputations and So these were the stories that came, but there was a trend track to that story. One was we struggled to get access to systems that were not designed for us, but we had strength in our community. And we tell this story of culture's inclusion, and we tell it through an old ancient law, Olowari law, and we tell it the story of an ancient Mungo man. And so if you want to cast your mind around Indigenous disability, you have to cast your mind back 25,000 years. And so out in Western New South Wales, there's this archaeological site, and amongst it there are footprints in the clay. And what it is, amongst those footprints is this single right liner footprint. So right footprint, right footprint, right footprint, corresponding west footprint. And so they went and asked the Western archaeologists, they're going, what's going on here? We can't understand that, we've measured this. So someone had a really good idea and said, let's get some ancestral knowledge in. And they asked the elders of that group, the Wintubi people, and they'd, oh, that's a one-legged man and he's on a hunt. So the Western scientists went back and they measured and said, they're actually on a hunt and having a role and responsibility in this community. And we saw this twin story to the social inequalities we have. We tell this because we still see this culture of inclusion. It speaks to a worldview which says every single person has a place and purpose on this earth. That is a worldview. So if I translate my experience as a deaf person, the medical scientific world, they give me these cochlear implants. That's what they are. They're not listening devices. I'm not a copper. Everyone calm down. And they give me this fancy Latin title that classifies my disease. It's called otosclerosis, which is a bone thing, which means my bones is ossified and I can't hear. So they give me that medical diagnosis. And what they do is they fix me. They see me, oh, I'm going to fix the deficit in your body by giving you something. And my research is to make the technical support that helps you communicate, helps you function. That's my medical model of research. In the cultural model of research, I'm not deaf or hearing impaired. I'm gifted by silence. So what I do is I can go to, we heard about country, I can go to the place where I feel safe and secure, where silence is my natural world. Now, people think country's a place on a map. For me, I do this. I go to deaf country. And I just go to this place where it's complete silence and it's the safest, secure place that I find in my life. And what I do is I own that place and no one can go there. And then I can come back in your Western world and do this and function in your world. Now, this is our philosophy. This is our knowledge that we bring. Now, the challenge for us is we see this is part of our culture. But the challenge for us is how do we bring this into policy and practice? How do we change our systems that will embrace that knowledge? Now, we have to do that. That's the work that we need to do as researchers. So that's the first contribution, is to get you all to buy in on a cultural knowledge of inclusion, a worldview where everyone has a place and purpose in this world. The second contribution that we can make is to give honour to our time-honoured tradition of truth-telling. Now, yesterday, people may be aware that there was a groundbreaking report that interrogated the impact and incidence of racism in the higher education sector. It was described by Aboriginal leaders as shocking but not surprising, and it spoke to some of the day-to-day barriers that if you are an Indigenous researcher living and working in the university sector, what you come up against, and how it manifested and presented itself in my research journey. We heard about cultural inclusion and it's spoken of wonderfully here, but it was not always like that. Not long after I published it, we copped the resistance. It's a bit of a third law of motion when you're doing social change. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So this was confronting. So when I was publishing it, getting grants or putting in papers, I would get the reply back, what you're doing is not really research. And again, this speaks to a deeper structural racism on the acceptance of Indigenous knowledges in a predominantly Western academic environment. And I get some comfort seeing the National Disability Research Partnership speak and embrace Indigenous knowledges, because it moves us to an optimism that those who continue to practice the belief that Indigenous disability knowledges is not really research, they may find themselves as not really relevant. That's the research, that's the experience of an Indigenous researcher, but I can point out to you the report that was not published yesterday or the day before or any day prior to that, and that is the incidence and impact of ableism in the higher education sector. And this is the great unspoken in education policy. This is the great unspoken in every university's social justice and inclusion framework, the avoidance of having a discussion around ableism. So how this part of my life presented in my research journey. I have always felt as a deaf person there's been this invisible wall around what I could and could not achieve as a researcher in a higher education system. Subtle things like leadership opportunities just passing by, and you kind of think, oh, is it just you? Is it just me? So I'd reach out and I'm going, oh, when I was dealing with racism and Indigenous, I had plenty of Aboriginal professors and mentors and leaders I could turn to. And I'm kind of going, well, where are all the deaf people? And I did not have that. And kind of couldn't make sense of that, but every now and then something would slip through and let the secret out. So when I was doing my PhD, I had to submit an ethics submission. And I wanted to interview deaf people. And the response come back from the Health and Medical Research Committee I had submitted to, if you want to interview deaf people, then you need to establish procedures to determine that they have the capacity to participate in research. And at that point in time, the advent of the NDIS was coming. And I thought I'd be handy if I got a little bit of help with this. These do wonders, but it'd be great. And I was asked to fill in a hearing handicap audit, in which one of the questions was, how handicapped does your hearing make you feel? And so here the secret is out. These subtle kind of tacit presumptions that we do not have the capacity to speak for themselves. And I think, I don't know, I'm still looking for the deaf mentor. I have not met another person in the academy, going to Canberra back and forwards, or in my executive life, I have not met one other person that has these cochlear implants. And I think that cannot be an accident. So that is the truth telling. Now I'm going to translate another piece of Indigenous knowledge to you and reference it to the agenda that the National Disability Research Partnership wants to promote, inviting you as research leaders to submit grants on safety and inclusive communities. What Indigenous knowledge teaches us is that our personal agency and the habitat in which we live at work are inextricably linked. So researchers, we call that social determinants. Hopefully that's very clear. If you want to be prosperous and working, you need to be able to do it in a safe and inclusive environment. So what this means for you as research leaders and chief investigators is that if you want to have people with disability on your grant, you need to look beyond the scope of your immediate project. You need to start buying into building a safe and inclusive place for a principal site in which is done. This means that you all need to sign up to dismantling ableism in higher education. And you need to be able to be confident to carry that discussion, not just within your groups, but in the whole institution and the sector that you need to overcome this awkward silence. And if I was to compare how racism is dealt with and responsive in this, and ableism, you are on your own if you challenge ableism. If you want to draw an angry crowd, start a conversation about racism. If you want to disband it, start one about ableism. That needs to change. And in reference to safety, I just want to point out, I'm not speaking against ableism because I feel safe and secure in doing so. I'm doing it actually in spite of not feeling safe. I'm doing it because even though I have a fancy academic title on my name, the torrent of ableism I see first-hand witness makes me ask what else is going on. So that's the challenge, and that's the truth-telling that I think us as academics need to be much more vocal about leading. The third contribution, and I'm going to change the tone here, and this is the reference to when we give our acknowledgement of country, we give respect to our elders past, present and emerging. This is to say the present we have has a history, have a past. We need to honour and respect that. That is so the next generation of disability researchers don't have to start again. We do that. Our change is progressive and intergenerational. And it is not perfect, and we will make mistakes, and I'm very accountable to the mistakes that I make. And we need to give our permission to do this. Social change is hard, and if you're feeling very uncomfortable by this discussion, you are actually paradoxically in the right mindset to make an impact. But our present has a past, and we'll have a future. And seeing and looking ahead into our future gives us a cause of optimism. So one of the things and programs that we're establishing in Girramar Indigenous Health is what we call the Saplings Program. So our listening to community was people would come to us and they would say, I'm really interested in youth justice. I've got this idea. And we're going, what's your project? And going, I don't know. And there was no place for them to cultivate that and give them space. The universities wanted to turn them up with a proposal, we'll give you a scholarship, but they actually had no coaching and mentoring them, this safe space to give them time to develop the confidence to speak to their proposal. So we have this Saplings program, we called it Saplings because we really wanted to make this a greenhouse for people who have the aspiration. And as at time of writing yesterday, applications still open, we had 11 applicants coming from our First Nations disability community. Of those, 5 have identified as having a disability. And the narrative was, look, if I can choose one, I'm deaf and have a hearing impairment. I started something, but I didn't feel supported. The message we are saying to them is research is hard. You need to do the work. But if you come and you do that work, we believe in you. Your community will back you. So it's not just giving them the technical skills, it's building that belief. And that is something they have not always heard. So that's a cause of optimism. And this is something that we see aligns with the values of the National Disability Research Partnership. The second thing is we do not just do research, we stand in front of classrooms of students about this big and we teach this. And our students, they're not putting with this non-exclusion stuff, they are actually inclusion as part of there. So this is not negotiable. You do not need to teach us why certain parts of our body work differently to others. We've worked that out. You do not need to teach us about Indigenous culture. We are people of our community. We know that. We want you to teach us how can we change the system? How can we make an impact? What is our part and our role in the journey? Teach us what has come before us so we can take this journey into the future. And that gives us optimism, and they're choosing to come. And I think they will be our greatest allies. If we get it wrong, they will be our greatest critics because they will write our history. And finally, I just want to say why I have signed up to the National Disability Partnership. And this comes from my community. I'm not long from coming back from Western New South Wales, trip to Wilcannia. And you go to those remote places and some of the disability access hasn't changed since when I did my PhD in 2017. Still the inaccessible, still where is the NDIS? And they said to me, so we don't want slogans anymore. We actually want to see stuff done. And I think this is where I'm signing up and optimistic. Not only is the National Disability Sydney has turned up with a vision, values, it is in the hands of community. It's giving us the resources to make a difference. So with that, I just want to say thank you, Maramboo Nyanyabu, for the opportunity. I see iconic disability researchers, so it has been quite humbling to stand in front of you and address you today and your respectful listening. So congratulations again to Mary and the National Disability Research Partnership. All power to you and all power to you who wish to be part of it.
Thank you very much, Scott. And sorry I had to race outside because we've got SBS here who are going to be telling the story of what we're doing today, and they're going to be interviewing Scott after this as well. So I'll just hold it for 5 minutes for questions. But we now have a time for a few questions for Scott. If anyone who is online, Sue will introduce those questions, and Jess is in the room with the microphone, and if you're going to ask a question, we need the microphone so that can go through. So would someone like to ask a question of Scott? Up the back, Sharon?
I'm just going to read the captioning, is that okay?
Absolutely, Scott. Well, thank you very much for your presentation. And my name is Sharon Kerr, and I'm a non-Aboriginal woman working with the Black Ability team in the University of Melbourne, looking at disability there. I'm just wondering, Scott, you've talked about what we can learn from Indigenous knowledges of disability. For all the people here who are going to, and online, who are going to be putting in research applications, how do you feel they should embrace Indigenous participation, not just consultation, but participation in their projects?
One of the differences between, if you like, Western approaches and methodologies of research is very procedure. Step 1, step 2, do your literature review, do this. Very different to how you would approach Indigenous research. Indigenous people generally are foremost relational. And we kind of have a view of the world that if you get the relationship right, things will happen. So work on the relationship first. And this is some of the reason why I'm here today. And I said you work on the relationship. And it gives us a safe place to have some of the awkward discussions, because we also understand that we're Indigenous cultures, but we live in a predominantly different system. So there is this cultural clash that we have to navigate. But we have the relationship to navigate that together. There's no hierarchy, there's no this. We understand that there's systemic ways of doing things, but we need to see progress and change. So first and foremost is to get the relationship. The other thing is you carry that relationship right through to the end. And one of the interesting things, it's probably a version of structural racism and ableism, is every scoping, systematic review I see people form teams, research teams, and they say, oh, we're talking to Indigenous people or people with disability. And I pick up their publication and I look at their citation and I go, who has shaped and formed your knowledge? And I just don't see the people with disability in that list. Again, it's like we've invited you in to tell your stories, but we will be the gatekeepers of the knowledge. And I think this is the subtle structural barriers that we have to break through. We don't just want to be tourists in here. We actually want to make difference. We want to actually have. This is a deeper concept than experiential, than lived experience. Lived experience is me coming telling you about my story and then you going away and doing what you can with it. Experiential knowledge going, my knowledge is not just of my community, but my experience of having to navigate systems that were not designed with me in mind is a form of knowledge as well. And you need to capture that experience of knowledge. It's not just this subject matter here. Change and social change needs to draw on that experiential knowledge as well. And we see it in ways we probably can't explain, but we know when there's strong and respected relationships. So that's our roundabout way, our Indigenous people, blackfellas, storytelling answers your question, I hope.
Thank you very much, Scott. We've got time for one more question in the room for you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kathleen. I am an autistic ADHD woman. I work for DARE Disability Services and I am a 1-week-old PhD student. Yeah, I'm going to replay that clap a lot. My question is around, I guess, getting a seat at the table. I've just left the education system as a secondary school teacher, and I've had a lot of conversations and done a lot of work with neurodivergent students, senior students particularly. As a neurodivergent person myself, I decided to put the money where my mouth is and not only disclose that, but to ask for accommodations and to be included in that conversation, which was point blank denied. How do we find people, our people, my people, and what are some of the ways we can get a seat at the table? Because I want one.
Congratulations on your PhD. Keep going. It'll be hard, but when you think quit, just remember you're doing this not just for you, for your community. You're an icon and role model of your community. Remember, for every person that says you don't have a seat, there's many, many others who want you there in your community that you're making a difference for. That's the first response to your question. You can control the quality of your work and the integrity and self-accountability. Essentially, that is what you can do. In time, you will learn that you can't change things on your own. And this is why I said to everyone else who's listening in on the conversation that we're having right now, if you do not have a seat at the table, but there are other people in this room who do have, they should be asking people, who else are people at that table, why is that not the case? And we find that if we're not in the room, and I see this with the Disability Royal Commission, I have seen groups and I've heard groups by accident that are talking about First Nations disability implementation, and I'm going, and people come up to me and they said, oh, why weren't you there? And I said, oh, I didn't know about it. And I go, did you actually say anything? And that's where we need others to speak up on our behalf, because if we're not in the room, we need others to go, hang on, they need to be represented in that voice. And when you get in that room, speak the truth. You do not turn up for the solutions, but you do not need to compromise on the values and principles of your community. That's the best advice I've been able to come up with.
Thank you, Scott. That is great advice, actually. We're just about out of time. Thank you. So excited you're joining our board. So excited about our partnership with Girramar at UTS. Like to acknowledge Jasmine as well. Thank you, Jasmine. Your contribution today reminds us this is not just a technical issue, and it's relational, structural, cultural and profoundly human. So thank you, Scott.